So for all of you who don't know me, my name is Shoghig Halajian. I'm a curator and writer. Jamila, Lanka, thank you. Connie and Amanda. And Martha, thank you for the keynote. Okay, so we're going to start today's conversations with our first panel titled Borders, Bodies, and Access to Knowledge as Power. So before introducing you to our group, I just want to recall a particularly poignant kind of distinction that one of our panelists made. Unfortunately, she could not be here today, but Jennifer Gonzalez, while discussing the work of artist Isaac Julian, discusses a distinction between a traditional approach to history and a genealogical approach to history. So, citing Foucault, she writes that while a traditional approach constructs sweeping, grand narratives, a genealogical model makes provisional accounts based on fragments and partial evidence, and charts the multiple relationships of bodies to systems of power. She cites, its task is to expose how a body is imprinted by history and history's destruction of bodies. So this idea got me thinking about today about borders and bodies and access to knowledge, and wondering how are we defining bodies and how are we deconstructing and historicizing borders, which is to say, how are we to understand the shifting multiple relationships between power, knowledge, and the body. Just a week ago, over breakfast, I had a conversation with an artist and filmmaker, Basma Al-Sharif. We were discussing her video work, Deep Sleep. So in the work, Basma documents the landscape of Gaza while she's in a self-induced hypnotic trance. So she walks around the city holding a Super 8 camera, recording the sights and sounds around her, while her mind is in an altered state. It's both in and beyond the confines of Gaza. So this meditative practice, embedded in an artistic one, allows her to collapse multiple locations and points to a possibility of transcending confinement in newly imagined ways. It also points to the way that borders confine bodies, but they also confine imaginaries. Borders are material imprisonment, but they're also psychic imprisonment. Borders are material, but they're also visual. So visual tropes and media representation construct the bodies of those who are deemed outside borders, outside belonging. Which is to say that borders are productive. They produce bodies and they produce identities. They produce the illegal body, the migrant body, the refugee body. They produce the criminal, the contaminant, the other. Which is borders construct the image of the legitimate social body versus the illegitimate rebel body. Borders also rely on narratives. They rely on the coherent, sweeping narratives that suppress the individual, that erase specificity, nuance, difference, for an overarching whole, for an overarching idea, which is the idea of the state, the institution, the university, private property, et cetera, et cetera. And while they limit movement and restrict bodies, borders are also disembodied. That is, they rely on the disembodied narratives and the idealized notion of the state, the institution, the university, the individual, et cetera, et cetera. So what would it mean to commit to a feminist embodied practice that disrupts coherence and abstraction? What would it mean to commit to a feminist practice that accounts for the gendered and raced overdetermination of our lives and for the material and psychic conditions that shape our lives? As artists, curators, writers, scholars, and students, how are we to draw on time and place in order to locate knowledge, to situate knowledge locally, so that we come to understand borders not as an abstract concept, but rather as a set of everyday practices that are repeatedly and daily performed by individuals, and in their very being as practices susceptible and malleable, that they can be unsettled just as much as they are unsettling. So how can a feminist practice re-embody these abstracted, sweeping narratives? in order to reveal the slippery and performative nature of boundaries, of their failures and vulnerabilities, and the possibility to transcend confinement in newly imagined ways. So I believe today's panelists will offer some generative insights. I have been following all of their work for quite some time, continue to be inspired by all of their practices, and I'm tremendously thrilled to be able to introduce them here to you today. So I'm going to go through some just short bios, and then we can jump with our first panelist. So our first panelist is Gelare Khoshgozaran. Gelare is an interdisciplinary artist and writer working across video, installation, performance, and writing. She received her MFA from the University of Southern California in 2009 and her BFA from the University of Arts in Tehran. Her work has been exhibited in solo and group exhibitions at the Queens Museum of Art, Museo Exterese Arte Actual, Malmö Kunsthall, LACE, the LA Municipal Art Gallery, Southern Exposure, Human Resources, Interstate Projects, and the AC Institute, among others. Gelare was a recipient of the 2017 Art Matters Award, the 2016 Remo Hortman Foundation Award for Emerging Artists, the 2015 Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Award, and the 2015 California Community Foundation Fellowship for the Visual Arts. Born in Tehran, living and working in Los Angeles, she's the co-founding editor of contemporary.org. So our next panelist, Kay-Sue Park, is a housing attorney and the Critical Race Studies Fellow at the UCLA School of Law from 2017 to 19, and was previously a fellow at Equal Justice Works from 2015 to 2017. She earned her BFA from Cornell University, her Master's of Philosophy from the University of Cambridge, her JD cum laude from Harvard Law School, and her PhD from University of California, Berkeley. Her publications have appeared in The History of the Present, Law and Social Inquiry, and Law and Society Review. Okay. And our third panelist today, Litia Perta, is a professor of art at the University of California, Irvine, where she teaches art writing and critical and curatorial studies. She received her PhD from the Department of Rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley in 2007. Through lyrical, nonfiction, critical theory, and performance, her research mobilizes an interdisciplinary examination of the ways in which non-normative subjectivities, particularly those that have been historically marginalized, come to personhood through art. She lives in Los Angeles with her cat, her bright star person, and their 10-month-old child, who I've had the pleasure of spending some time with. Okay, thank you. Gelare, thank you.
It's often surprising to my Canadian friends that we don't begin our art and cultural events by acknowledging land. I just wanted to say that I'm not a native of this land. I'm an immigrant, and I wanted to acknowledge the native inhabitants of this land. I also wanted to acknowledge a couple of friends, old and new, who were influential in this project that I'm presenting as very rough, kind of sharing of my research. Emily Mishkin and her project Incendiary Traces, and my friend Nima Ismailpour were very generous and helped me a lot through their research and practice in thinking about this. I once wrote, part jokingly, part poetically, the worst thing about being a refugee is that you have sworn to seek protection from one state because another state has failed to provide it to you. Asylum is the protection sought against one state granted by another. In thinking about feminism and the state as they relate to the question of what is contemporary, I often think about war and how anti-war activism had been historically an important part of feminist practice and queer activism. In her visionary 2004 film, November, Hito Steyerl distinguishes between October days and hours, at the time 14 years ago. In a scene where she is participating in a protest against the invasion of Iraq, we hear these words, quote, "Instead, we are in the period of November, where revolution seems to be over and peripheral struggles have become particular, localist, and almost impossible to communicate. In November, the former heroes become madmen and die in extra-legal execution somewhere on a dirty roadside. and information about it is so diffused with predictable propaganda that hardly anyone takes a closer look. According to PRI, the United States is currently, by a conservative definition, involved in war with 5 countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen. I think every day about the fact that we don't protest these wars anymore, despite their occurrence and despite our knowledge of them in queer feminist times. There is no official declaration for when we enter a war, and at no point where it stops. War and militarization are so entwined with culture that they're inseparable from it. What is resistance now in these post-apocalyptic homo-nationalist times? The artist as the close looker, the artist as the deep listener, the artist as the flight data recorder, the artist as the anti-war practitioner. My presentation today begins in a desert where beheaded date palms are intimately rooted in seeping crude oil somewhere in the Middle East. The term Middle East originated in the British India Office in the 1850s, a turbulent decade of colonial expansion and wars, a decade also marked by the Great Exhibition, the Crystal Palace Exhibition of 1851, where the world was arranged to be exhibited, perceived, and consumed under a new exhibitionary order. The term Middle East, however, was not widely used until 1902, when Alfred T. Mahan used it in his essay, The Persian Gulf and International Relations, published in the National Review and later in his book, Retrospect and Prospect. 1902 was also the year the date industry was born in California. Much like the origin of the word Middle East, however, there are debates over the exact year dates were cultivated here. California was introduced cultivars from Middle East and North Africa as early as the 1890s. After extensive research travels to those regions to study the climate and date cultivation. The similarities between the climate of the California desert and that of the Arabian and Sahara deserts did not go unnoticed to the visionaries. Historian Sarah C. Katz reminds us, quote, "These trips to the greater Middle East for the date palms provide some of the first links between the two regions. The interactions these government scientists and local entrepreneurs had with the people of the Middle East are extraordinary, and they speak not only to the complicated geopolitical realities of the area, but also to American assumptions of racial and scientific superiority." One Los Angeles Times article about the growing date palm industry, published in 1921, suggested that, quote, "The American scientific culture has far surpassed the Orient in date possibilities. In fact, in the hot sand around Indio and Coachella, the date has come to surpass anything of which the dozing Orient ever dreamt," unquote. The marketing of the date as an industry required its painstaking product placement, however. The early 20th century date festivals led to the post-war Riverside County fairs with its Arabian night pageants, genies, harem girls, camel rides, a legacy that I learned continues today. The 2018 Riverside County Fair and Date Festival closes tomorrow. In the home of the date palm and the dosing oriental, in September 1980, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq abrogated the 1975 Algiers Agreement and declares it will exercise full sovereignty over the Shatt al-Arab to restore the legal position of it to the pre-1975 status. Iraq's invasion of Iran led to an 8-year war. In the end, while both sides claimed victory, Iraq failed to annex the Iranian province of Khuzestan and bolster Arab separatism. Iran failed to topple Saddam Hussein and export its revolution to the neighboring country. More than 1 million were dead on both sides. Casualties have been reported up to $620 billion. 95,000 Iranian soldiers. That's at a time when the population of Iran is 60 million. 95,000 child soldiers were made casualties, mostly between the ages of 16 and 17, but some even younger. A 2017 National Geographic report titled "Climate Change and Water Woes in Iraq" states, Hussein torched some of the southern Iraq's most bountiful date plantations for fear that Iranian saboteurs might use them as cover to attack oil facilities around Basra. Where once 12 million palm trees stood, there's now just miles of dusty scrubland laced with oil spills. Right after the invasion of Iraq, US Army prepared mock villages of Afghan and Iraqi towns to prepare the troops for insurgent warfare. The archipelago of Middle Eastern towns, in Stephen Graham's words, were built 7,777 miles away from Basra, Iraq, based on the realities awaiting the soldiers outside Baghdad and Mosul and Fallujah. The modular nature of these mock towns, however, allowed the troops to prepare from one battle to the other. A New York Times article from 2006, as if promoting a newly discovered hot neighborhood of Los Angeles for real estate development, reports, quote, Arab Americans, many of them from the Iraqi expatriate community in San Diego, populate a group of mock villages resembling these counterparts in Iraq. I lost my line. American soldiers at forward operating bases nearby faced insurgent uprising, suicide bombing, and even staged beheading in the underground tunnels. Recently, the soldiers here, like their counterparts in Iraq, have been confronted with Sunni Shia riots. At one village, a secret guerrilla revolt is in the works, unquote. Quoting again, the footprint of the village came from actual satellite imagery of Baghdad, said Captain Seth Henson, acting resident engineer at Fort Irwin, quote, the LA district worked with the Corps Engineer Research and Development Center to ensure the construction design was authentic to Iraqi standards. Everything is authentic to the dimensions. Parsons, the contractor, has extensive experience building in Iraq, which is key. They contacted the experts in Iraq. They had their people bringing back samples from Iraq to make sure we matched what we were building, unquote. Although the most popular and most elaborate Fort Irwin is only one of the many bases that house such simulacra. On the tropical side, mock Korean towns are built in the Hawaiian bases, offering similar culture and language training to the troops. According to the US Army's website, quote, the buildings are not the only way the NTC, National Training Center, approximates Iraq in California for soldiers training. Actors and role players add to the realism of the simulation by portraying an assortment of Iraqi villagers. This allows the NTC to better replicate the sounds and smells of Iraq, unquote. These villages, however, are in no way a new instrument for colonial rule. They are the legacy of the colonial villages on display at the World Fairs and the Great Exhibition as far as the mid-19th century. In Orientalism and the Exhibitionary Order, Timothy Mitchell writes, quote, by the last decade of the 19th century, more than half the description of journeys to Europe published in Cairo were written to describe visits to a world exhibition on our International Congress of Orientalists. Such accounts devote hundreds of pages to describing the peculiar order and technique these events, the curious crowds of spectators, the organization of panoramas and perspectives, the arrangement of natives in mock colonial villages, the display of new inventions and commodities, the architecture of iron and glass, the systems of classification, the calculations of statistics, the lectures, the plans, and the guidebooks. In short, the entire method of organization that we think of as representation, unquote. I'm dying. In the context of the Great Exhibition of 1851, and the series of world fairs that followed, what Arab writers found in the West, Mitchell argues, quote, were not just exhibitions and representations of the world, but the world itself being ordered up as an endless exhibition. The world as exhibition was a place where the artificial, the model, and the plan were employed to generate an unprecedented effect of order and certainty, unquote. The cycle of world as exhibition, Orientalism, and colonial rule in relation to the Middle Eastern towns of the US military training sites is what I am most interested in studying through my physical presence there. Edward Said shows us how in the classic Orientalist text, the Oriental is suggested as the exotic that is in opposition to the indigenous in a botanical analogy. The presence of the Orientalist Middle Eastern simulacrum towns on indigenous stolen land in the Mojave perfectly demonstrates the colonial narrative of domination and conquest as a twisted continuum. The nopales on the side of the road in a scene from homeland that is supposed to take place a few miles outside of Tehran is a moment where the land, in this case California desert, breathes momentarily and in its exhale paints the new colonial plot to conquer Tehran against a long history of colonialism here at home. These errors of the fabricators, writers, and policy experts that leave traces in the material conditions of how spaces, scenes, and simulacra supposedly representing the Middle East are built is what has drawn me to Fort Irwin. Said again. We need not look for correspondences between the language used to depict the Orient and the Orient itself, not much because the language is inaccurate, but because it is not even trying to be accurate, unquote. Mitchell again. This machinery of representation was not confined to the exhibition and the Congress. Almost everywhere that Middle Eastern visitors went, they seemed to encounter the arrangement of things to stand for something else, for something larger. The world as exhibition means not an exhibition of the world, but the world organized and grasped as though it were an exhibition, unquote. Not only do US and allies continue to dominate, exploit resources, and occupy the Middle East, the US practices its strategies in the simulacrum of the Middle East built on stolen land in the Mojave Desert. The Middle East is constructed here at home as a conflation of Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, you name it, as a malleable placeholder for whatever country we are officially at war with. In the palimpsests of such colonial arrangement and history, language becomes a site of forensics. The mock town's name, first in Farsi, Ertabat Shahr, changes to the Arabic name Medina Wasl, a name that does not translate, but is declared by the reporters of the US Army as attempting to mean connecting town. This is where my presentation today ends and my project begins.
Two things have really shaped how I think about the border. Those are the research and writing I've done on the history of colonization and land dispossession here in North America, especially on the creation of real estate, and also my experience living and working as a legal aid attorney in El Paso, Texas, which is on the border of Texas, Mexico, and also New Mexico. And when I was there, I was a foreclosure and eviction defense attorney, so I was thinking about real estate all the time, in the present moment too. So what I study is really the creation of the private property system in America. I look at the legal mechanisms by which settlers appropriated land from indigenous people during the colonial period and beyond, or how real estate was produced through processes of dispossession. And this involves thinking about the difference between all of the capacities of land, its histories, how it supports human and non-human life, versus the idea of land understood as a commodity to be bought or sold. And the very idea of land as a commodity to be bought or sold comes into being through the very process of conquest in America. There was never a circumstance before European settlement here in which people conceived of the land in quite this way, as a vast expanse that could be converted into smaller pieces that could be owned and enclosed for exclusive use, and thus converted into profit. And so you can probably already see how the border becomes very important. In order for land to be owned, for you to know who owns what and who doesn't, you need to know exactly how much of it there is. You need to measure it, you need to know where the boundary is, and where someone else's property begins. And the conversion of this land, where we are now, into a vast grid of enclosures was a massive project, often unwieldy. It involved getting surveyors to go out and do their best to impose grids on nature, which does not run in straight lines. And so you can imagine how hard it is to measure out uniform parcels of land with 22.5-foot chains on irregularly sloping hills, and what happens if you run into a cliff or a swamp. But of course, the biggest problem was that the land was already inhabited by many different political communities, not amenable to this project. And colonists first, and then the United States later, could not and did not just go out and wage war for the inhabited lands that they already claimed under the doctrine of discovery. They really couldn't afford this kind of pursuit. and they couldn't pursue this kind of direct conquest. They didn't have the funds. They didn't have the military. And so, especially right after the Revolutionary War, which is when the US really wanted to use these lands, wanted and needed most to use the sale of land to produce revenue, it was very bankrupt and in debt. And so what they did instead was to create structures of incentives for settlers to go out. Generally, surveyors went out first. I mean, really, the process was extremely chaotic, but that was the idea, was that surveyors would go out first to impose a grid on the land, and then they promised settlers that the government would eventually sell them that land if they went out and cultivated it. And cultivating here means building cabins, clearing forests, building fences, to lay claim to a parcel of land and defend it against others, especially its inhabitants or its former inhabitants. And settlers' job was to defend the land from edge to edge, corner to corner, to spread disease, to chase away enough game, and to make life difficult enough for the people already living there, so that it would become easier for the colony or the US to eke a land cession out of the tribe. The government worked really hard to control settlers' dispersal and ensure that the land was evenly covered by settlers who wanted to make claims. And this required a huge bureaucracy that would regulate how land got distributed to settlers, the establishment of land offices, officers, an extensive administrative apparatus to control what Francis Paul Prucha calls the orderly progression of the frontier. So you can see how the concept and material project of creating real estate with edges, how the border was already important even in this early period. But those edges then, even with fences, remained pretty hypothetical as long as the claim was getting staked in the zone that they called the frontier. And the frontier was any region that was still significantly inhabited by native people, near territory where whites felt like they were in solid possession of the land. Regions between land still controlled by tribes and land mostly controlled by settlers. And we hear a lot about the western frontier, but it wasn't always west, it was really in all directions. It was anywhere where the project of conquest was deemed incomplete. Anywhere proximate to where settlers limited their encroachment on other people's land, where there were people whose very existence challenged settler sovereignty. So the frontier was a space of violence, a place that settlers viewed as a threat to white society and to settler jurisdiction. And now, as a result of all of these processes, literally every inch of land in the United States is accounted for and measured. It's all under public or private ownership, and at least hypothetically, ultimately at the disposal of the state. In other words, the land is on total lockdown. So for me, the border is the place where this particular system of real estate stops, where you get to the edge of US empire, where that particular way of making land a commodity has a geographical limit, and also where land therefore stops having the value that it has as US real estate. Mexican real estate, for example, is not as valuable as US real estate on the global market, and that difference is determined by the border. So just as the firm edge is important to every individual piece of private property, it's also important to the entire collective project that renders this landmass a commodity infrastructure. The national borders are also still areas where the project of conquest is deemed incomplete, where it's a daily exercise to assert US sovereignty with a show of military force and violence against people who are nationals of a competing sovereignty. So this includes the southern border and also the northern border, but also all ports of entry. And as my friends in the Red Nation point out, there are also around the 326 reservations or lands on which Native nations still maintain their sovereignty. And so this is one way that I understand the border, as one large, nationally recognized and very highly politicized example of all of that. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the border, the part of the border where I lived, and the landscape around the city I lived in, so I can explain a little bit about how I see the impact that the border has on people's lives. El Paso is at the end of the Rockies. It's also in the Chihuahua Desert. And so driving up from a distance, you see this mountain range. You see a gap, you see a valley between mountains that looks like the mountains are in conversation. And as you get closer, you see a sprawling city in that valley. And it makes perfect sense that people would seek shelter between the mountains and along the river, especially in the desert. It just looks like any city clustered around a river, running through a valley between mountains, just the way people have settled all over the world forever. And it isn't until you get closer that you understand a fence is running through that city and stretching out on either side of it into the desert as far as you can see. That fence artificially split that city where people have been living together for so long, since 2008. It marks the border between the United States and Mexico. So on the northern side of this border, El Paso is literally wrapped around a mountain. It's kind of a U shape. And the part that dips furthest down south is just exactly where the downtown touches Juarez is downtown. And it's at that point that there's a walking bridge which runs across a river. And there's been a bridge there ever since the river was a healthy river that ran very wide and even had a shore. And the bridge was also wide and open. But now the bridge is a very tightly controlled couple of walking tunnels on either side of a car bridge. It runs over a river, which is very sad these days. It's kind of this polluted little trickle that runs through a concrete conduit and has 3 rows of barbed wire fence on the US side. On the other side, Juarez just sprawls out and runs, again, just right up against a mountain so that there are mountains just sandwiching the 2 cities in together. The border bridges are the worst. The lines are really long, and the guards harass you like it's their job, and the car lines are even longer because they often only open up 2 or 3 of the 8 or 9 lanes that are there, so people have to wait for hours to cross, and they just idle on the bridge. They create a bottleneck on the bridge that's pretty much never-ending on purpose. And it's hard to explain how stupid and also tragic everyone who lives there finds this fence, and the checkpoints that are still pretty new, which make it harder and slower to do everything from seeing your family members to getting some shopping done to going to work. The border there is this awful artificial imposition that just feeds on people's time and energy and makes them tired and frustrated and sad. The border definitely makes it more likely that some people on either side are just going to spin in their own orbits, trying to pretend like they're not, the other side isn't in plain view all of the time. But despite these blockages, it's still a community, even if it's a more painful community to be a part of, and people's families and histories and ancestry are still all wrapped up on both sides of the border, and people are dealing with the new situation as best as they can. So what I'm trying to say is that as I see it, the city is still clearly one organism that is surviving the barbed wire that's literally strung through the center of its body. So that's another way that I think about the border. Talking to a room full of artists. So some years ago, I went to the Lightning Field. And I think most of you, but not all of you, will know what that is, so I'm just going to briefly explain. It's a land art piece by Walter Di Maria in western New Mexico, and it's an experience. What happens is you go to an office, and the van picks you up with maybe 4 other people, and it takes you out for a drive. You're in the car for maybe 2 hours, and you don't know where you're going, and then it drops you off at a cabin where you all spend the night. And there's 3 bedrooms, a pan of enchiladas in the fridge and stuff for breakfast, and it's not good and it's not terrible, it's just fine. And then the next day you all get picked up and you go back. It's pretty rustic there. There's not a ton of furniture. And outside the cabin, there are 420-foot tall-ish stainless steel rods spaced out as if they were a grid. And on all sides, the horizon stretches out as far as the eye can see. And the idea is that during storm season, that is the perfect place to watch the desert lightning, and maybe a pole will draw a lightning bolt to it. And my understanding is that this has only ever happened once, and that after it happened, the rod then needed to be replaced. So the lightning field is a very hypothetical experience also, or maybe symbolic. Maybe it's meant to launch you into a meditation on something that will almost certainly not happen. Or about how the field full of very orderly rods itself sculpturally evokes a lightning field more than an installation that actually creates a relationship between lightning and earth. So when I went there, I was already pretty deep in my thinking about settlement and land expropriation in the United States. And so this place launched me into a very different kind of meditation, I think, than a lot of people have there. I had no idea that this kind of art vacation was going to take me to a site so evocative of and symbolic of exactly what I was studying. I was going to spend the night in a log cabin built exactly in the tradition of a settler cabin, situated in a manor on land that was essentially a settler's claim. This is the New Mexico desert. It's not farmland. This isn't a ranch. It's a perfect place to think about what one cabin, one home per 40-acre tract, or 80-acre tract, or 160-acre tract, or however much land the person there is trying to stake a claim to, just what that looks like. It means that your neighbors are really far away. It means that there's no one in sight, and you just go on like that into the distance, one family per claim, far apart and dispersed from one another, and then maybe once in a while you stumble across a little town that helps all these outliers sustain themselves. And this is a very lonely, weird formation. And what it made me think about is that people have never really lived like this. It just wasn't the way they formed societies. You know, they lived together and they gathered around rivers and in valleys like in El Paso and Juarez. But this atomized pattern of settlement, this way of spreading out on the land, is very American. It's very settler. And it's very particular to a plan that was meant to further US expansion, following the surveyor's grid and rectangles, marking lines on the land and corners to define who owns what. And again, the United States ordered settlement in this way to bait people to go out and stake a claim with definable boundaries in the hopes that they could own it one day. So you had to clear the land of trees, if there were any, so you could see people approaching and shoot anyone you didn't want there. And people were there literally to mark off a claim against all others, to make a piece of property that would come under the jurisdiction of the United States and to make Native people leave. And dispossession proceeded in this way. The creation of property proceeded in this way. And I want to say that the only way that the border as we know it became possible was through this process. And now it's this site, it's the center of an art piece that I think most visitors just find very charming and are thrilled to stay in for a night. And it's very strange. It's this very experiential art piece that takes you to a site that's emblematic of the historical processes of indigenous land expropriation and also distribution of the public lands. And it asks you to enjoy this weird example of the atomization of human life, this artificial isolation created by the pattern of settlers' claims, by disconnecting you to the material history of the land and imposing instead an artificial interface between physical and abstract space, and by bringing you into a temporal horizon that is supposed to represent a disconnect from your life. And in that way, it creates this experience of the actual land that's romanticized, commodified, specialized, and rarefied into a meditation on space and nature in a way that's historyless and echoes the same patterns of the surveyor's grid and Western perspectival view in a way that both lifts it into a parallel with a blank slate that's meant to invoke the museum, and that also makes it much harder to question the processes by which this all came about and its fundamental connection in the end to the colonial idea of free and vacant lands. So I've told you about the border in El Paso and the lightning field because from my perspective, these two examples of land divisions come out of the same history, the same system also of land proprietorship that we have in this country today. And so I wanted to highlight the ways that they're continuous with each other, both consequences of that same process of converting the surface of the earth into something to be bought and sold on the market. But the truth is I don't really think people very often think about the border in terms of real estate and private property. And I also think that they think even less about the lightning field that way. In El Paso, where that system so violently rips across an organic community, I think that they don't think about it because of the distraction of the militarization of the border, especially there, where that total edge that maintains this whole system lies in the shadow of the second largest military installation in the world. This degree of militarization to me is also an indication of the property interests that are at stake. The totality of the US real estate system, the housing stock is valued at around $30 trillion. And so it's a very important market, and anyone who wants to make some money is going to have an interest somewhere in land. 60% of all global assets are in land now, and 80% of all bank loans made in the US, Canada, Great Britain, and Australia are mortgages. So what makes it hard to think about historical land processes at the lightning field? And what does an art piece like this assume to set up an experience that abstracts from what is already an abstraction of the lands in the way that it does? Part of it, I think, just like in El Paso, is that we've naturalized the idea of private property, so much so that we rarely ask about what happened to make the divisions that we traverse or can't traverse every day. But I think that differently from El Paso, the lightning field also sets up questions about how people embrace that idea of a blank slate, you know, of the canvas, but also of history, and the idea that you can make nature what you want, even if what you want is to imagine it as something reified and powerful that is acting on you in a way that is wild and pure, and divorced from a past relationship to other people and from a land system that is continuing to do so much violence all over the country and the world, even as you're standing right inside it. Thank you.
So they say we have, this is a quote from the Undercommons, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. They say we have too much debt. We need better credit, more credit, less spending. They offer us credit repair, credit counseling, microcredit, personal financial planning. They promise to match credit and debt again, debt and credit. But our debts stay bad. We keep buying another song, another round. It's not credit we seek, nor even debt, but bad debt, which is to say real debt, the debt that cannot be repaid, the debt at a distance, the debt without creditor, the black debt, the queer debt, the criminal debt, excessive debt, incalculable debt, debt for no reason, debt broken from credit, debt as its own principle. Okay. I forgot to say thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Lanka and Jamila and Mocha and everyone, and thanks also Gelare and Kesu especially for all of your work and all of your words, not just today, but every day. Okay. I'm going to skip all the preamble. Okay. It's on very large print because I don't see very well. Okay. So what I'm going to share with you today is a series of unfinished notes and thoughts, fragments really, of what I hope will be a longer piece on things I have been thinking about and living through for a long time. In many ways, the very act of standing before you in this way with a PowerPoint presentation tidily behind me is anathema to the work that I do. These are the very structures and hierarchies of knowledge I'm interested in resisting, which is why I'm not going to forward any of the slides. You'll just see that for a long time. What I'm going to share with you is both personal and systemic, things which concern me deeply and about which I hope to spark more discussion. So 1, the university, the state. When I was invited to present at this day-long event that fit under the rubric of feminism and the state, I knew immediately that I would speak on the university. It is the most sustained, intimate, and visible contact that I have with the state, the one from which I glean the most information, the one that has the most immediate and far-reaching effects on my physical, emotional, and psychic life. I work for the University of California as an assistant professor on the tenure track at Irvine. I began this position almost 5 years ago, but for the last 19 years, I have been in and out of relationship with the University of California. I began my PhD at Berkeley in '99, completed it in 2007, returned there in 2010 for a lectureship position, and was hired by Irvine in 2013. This history has given me a unique and not altogether comfortable perspective into the machinations of what is still called the public university of the state of California. Because the UC system remains public and thus in some ways is determined by the politics of the state legislature, as a university employee, I am also considered an employee of the state of California. As such, the question of how my own feminism interacts with and survives in relation to the state, as well as how I would like to see feminism grow and become the basis of more policy, all this happens for me in the arena of the university. There's no abstraction for me in the question of feminism and the state. It has concrete, everyday implications for my thinking, my well-being, my life, and now the life of my small family. While this position of being entangled in a university system is undeniably one of privilege, I chose to speak on it here in part because so many of us are embroiled in university systems of one kind or another. As former students managing student debt, as prospective students hoping for degrees, as current students, as adjuncts, as lecturers, as laboratory or studio assistants, as fellows, as temporary employees, assistants, and full professors. Moreover, the narrative of the university being not only the answer to a kind of upward mobility in this country, but also increasingly the narrative of the university being necessary for a kind of survivability in this country, this cultural story seems locked in. So the university is the arena in which I'm thinking about feminism and the state. 2, feminism. It seems important here to consider what I mean by feminism. For me, it's not about equality, which presumes that everything would be okay if only those of us who have been historically marginalized would be given the same rights and privileges as those who have enjoyed positions of power. While equality is most certainly important, the kind of feminism I'm interested in has to do with a radical rethinking of all structures of power that determine our daily lives. I think of Audre Lorde and her brilliant and cautionary essay, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," where she writes, quote, "The Master's tools will never dismantle the Master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the Master's house as their only secure sense of support, unquote. The system is not likely to come tumbling down because of the tools given to us by the system itself. I return again and again to another line of Audre Lorde's work from an essay entitled Sexism, an American Disease in Blackface, where she writes, "It's not the destiny of Black America to repeat white America's mistakes, but we will if we mistake the trappings of success in a sick society for the signs of a meaningful life." With this thinking in mind, feminism for me has much more to do with a radical restructuring of systems of power and commerce and education, and the ways we understand ourselves as individuals, individuals written through and through by the collectivity from which we emerge. So 3, privatization. The cost of attending the University of California is well above the national average for public universities. It costs approximately $12,000 per year for undergraduate tuition and fees. If you'd like to board on campus, your costs are $30,000 per year. While this is far less than private colleges that can raise tuitions from year to year with no explanation or accountability whatsoever, it means that a 4-year public undergraduate education in the state of California will run your family anywhere from $48,000 to $120,000. If the idea of public education is that it be accessible to anyone who cares to attend college and can make it through the rigorous application process, it doesn't take too much to see that these numbers are prohibitive for a great many families. Increases in tuition are one of the most effective ways the public institution begins to privatize. There is a professor of political science at UC Riverside, Farah Godrej, who has argued compellingly that tuition hikes, budget cuts, and other so-called austerity measures in the UC system are actually at the heart of a strategy of privatization that aims to dismantle the democratizing effect of higher education on the state's population. She points out, and these are her words, "This shift hits the least privileged the hardest so that the accessibility and affordability of this education is eroded, particularly for those who are least able to afford this burden. Access to education," still her words, "in this system depends, 1, on already having the wealth and privilege to pay the exponentially multiplied fees, or 2, taking on unimaginable amounts of student debt, which in turn provides profitable investment for banks. The outcome of this deliberate plan is to further widen the inequalities of income to reinforce existing privileges of race, wealth, and class." That's the end of her words. As the amount of funding from the state of California to the university diminishes from year to year, the burden is placed increasingly on students to carry the cost. The belief that public education benefits the common good is progressively eroded, and education becomes a product to be jockeyed for in the marketplace. Raising in-state tuitions is one form of the process of privatization, but the university has also been accepting increasingly large numbers of out-of-state tuitions who are required to pay tuition fees far closer to those at private institutions. Of particular interest to the UC system are students from other countries. These students pay the exorbitant out-of-state fees outright because they are ineligible for financial aid from the United States. In my experience at Irvine, it's not uncommon to have a classroom speckled by students completely unprepared to do university-level work in English, because having on campus remedial language and reading resources for such students would be tantamount to the university admitting its nefarious recruitment of foreign students, irrespective of their levels of preparation. Foreign students who need help will not find it on the Irvine campus. The school will take their money and set them up to fail. Like many campuses, Irvine is also overrun with a food court that boasts a Starbucks, a Jamba Juice, Subway, Wendy's, and a Panda Express. Those are the few that occupy the prime real estate on campus, right next to the library and the main humanities lecture hall. Last summer, the bookstore was overtaken by Barnes & Noble, and students this year have been disappointed to find that the books with little to no market value that they are required for their courses are no longer carried in the bookstore. While these forms of privatization are evidence of a system willing to put corporate interests above the interests of students, there are perhaps more complex and troubling strategies in place. After years of mismanaging pension funds and with the exponential rate increase of healthcare premiums, the Central University of California system realized it no longer had sufficient funds to pay for employee benefits. So in 2013, the university decentralized its benefits program and gave each of the schools money to cover and disperse their respective campuses' benefits. But the money each campus received was not sufficient to cover the cost. So during the fall of this year, the bulk of the faculty meetings in the Department of Art at UC Irvine were devoted to trying to brainstorm how to come up with money to pay for our own benefits, because the university was so far in the red that it had placed the responsibility from the university to the schools and from the schools to the departments. If it were not so painful, there would have been something laughable about watching 20 or so middle-aged artists trying to figure out how to solve a complex economic problem that has to do with the commingling of corrupt healthcare companies and irresponsible university governance. In the midst of this, the UC regents, most of whom come from industry, are exceptionally wealthy, and have likely never worked a night shift in their lives, decided to begin considering to revoke the healthcare benefits of current retirees. So if you have already served your 20 or 40 or 30 years of teaching in the system, and if you made the decision to continue, in part because the university promised you healthcare until you died, soon you may be out of luck. There are countless ways the University of California comports itself increasingly like a for-profit business that works to enrich a small group of people at the top while systematically impoverishing those who comprise the base. The danger in tangling education with profit is that it quickly becomes difficult to gauge who benefits from what, but the answer is seldom education. 4, questions. So I have some questions. Given all of this, what does the failure of these systems, what does the failure of these systems teach our students? In what way do the structures of this kind of education system threaten to undermine the content of our classes, however enlightened they may be? What concerns me is not so much access to knowledge as power, which is one of the titles of this particular panel, but rather what kind of knowledges we are opening to and what kinds of knowledges we are closing down. Who has access to the university determines the kinds of knowledges I will find there, and conversely, what kind of knowledges I will find there determine what kind of bodies the university can accommodate. So, is there space in the system for all of us? And if the answer is yes, I want to know at what cost. I've worked as an assistant professor in the system for 5 years and have had the privilege of having access to healthcare, a steady monthly paycheck, limited research and travel money, a new computer, an office of my own, and excellent students. But lately I am thinking more and more, at what cost? At what cost do we participate in systems that are not made for us and then absorb the structural violence that those positions entail? I arrived at UC Irvine thrilled to have finally found the unicorn that is the tenure-track job. 6 years after receiving my doctorate and having spent 2 of those years on unemployment, I could not have felt more lucky or more grateful. That's part of the setup. My Irvine experience has been unusual for a host of reasons it would take all day to enumerate, but one uncommon happenstance is that I was hired into my department at the same time as another junior faculty member. The 2 of us starting at Irvine at the same time meant I had a comrade and someone to discuss faculty meetings with and to generally share in the strangeness of this new position. It also happens that this person was white and straight, able-bodied, and male. I did not know at the time that public university salaries are considered part of the public record. Got it. And it did not occur to me to look up our respective salaries. I had a PhD where he had a master's degree, and in the somewhat arcane ranking system of the University of California, I was ranked at a level higher than he was on the basis of prior teaching experience. I was on track to come up to it for tenure for a year before he would, and more than any of this, I was so happy to have a salary of any kind that it did not occur to me to look at structural inequities. As it turns out, in his first year, his salary was $5,000 more than mine. In his second year, it was $8,000 more than mine. When I brought this to the equity advisor, I was told that the University of California paid certain people off scale if they had competing offers from other schools. I was also told that comparing my own salary to those of others in my department would never lead to good. Anyway, I explained that as someone who teaches gender studies and critical theory, it would be exceedingly difficult for me to come to work and do my job if some correction were not made. As it turned out, each year a series of reports is sent around to schools with guidelines for what people should be paid on the basis of their degree and the year they received it. And it happened that this national report agreed with me, and so my salary was raised to be only $3,000 less than his. Since that time, we have both become parents, he and I. He's a friend and a lovely human. And I have watched how differently our bodies move through this transition while navigating the university system. These are just some of the ways that people in the system are set up to achieve differently. There are many more. And I remember every day that I was invited into this university by a hiring committee that was all white. This is how the university, and by extension the state, sediments the inequities of a framework that was not made for certain bodies and that in many ways aims to exclude or destroy those bodies even as they are trying to participate. Above all things, we have been well trained in the United States to honor the kind of knowledge that is available to us through universities. But when our universities comport themselves increasingly like for-profit businesses, and when they privilege just certain bodies over others, I keep wondering, isn't it time for something else? Got it. I am interested in the knowledges not honored by these structures, the ones that cannot be wrangled into learning outcomes or measured by terms like inclusive excellence. I am interested in coming forward and asking one another, at what cost did you receive the knowledge you received from your university? What was your financial, but also your emotional, your psychic cost? The bodies. There is a haunting article that was published 10 years ago called The Future of Our Worlds, Black Feminism and the Politics of Knowledge in the University Under Globalization. Actually, this professor also works at UCLA. Grace Kyungwon Hong puts forth the possibility in it that a number of prominent Black feminists died early deaths because of the ways their bodies were made to struggle in the university, even as their work was expanding disciplines and generating new spaces. She says she follows the imperative of James Baldwin to bring out your dead. It's a really beautiful, haunting article that I strongly suggest. She names Barbara Christian, June Jordan, Shirley Ann Williams, Audre Lorde, Beverly Robinson, Indisha Ida Mae Holland, Claudia Tate, Nellie McKay, and Vivi Clark. She writes, quote, "It is shocking to say and impossible to prove that these women suffered early deaths because the battles around race, gender, and sexuality were being waged so directly through and on their bodies. Yet the names bear witness to this unknowable truth," unquote. So what happens to the bodies engaged in all of this? What happens to the bodies that are between feminism and the state? My position has been one of privilege, of that I am certain. I have fared far better than many, and still I have some answers. It's the body that spends hours with the ombudsman and equity advisors, hours with human resources, hours with the payroll people, asking why the salary is insufficient, hours not on work or inspiration. It's a body that worries constantly whether the work that it does is tenure-worthy, when the system is so broken that tenured faculty members often don't show up for meetings or even look at the files, but can be counted on to vote no anyway, just because. It's a body that, on a bad day, shape-shifts work to privilege projects that might not be the heart's call, but that look good in the automated file that will move through the department and onto the administration. It's a body that contorts and confuses as it says to people, I have a tenure-track job at the University of California, and people say back, I would kill for that job. It's a body that doesn't nurse the baby. It's a body that forgets to eat. It's a body that won't make time for exercise. It's a body that grades papers late. It's a body whose self is stretched so thin it's hard to like the person who's there. It's a body that is always tired but not often able to sleep. It's a body that doesn't heal. It's a body that constantly envisions other worlds and is forever seeking a way out.
So just kind of thinking about the panel's topic today and thinking about borders in varying ways and in different contexts. Litia, you were speaking about the kind of institutional context, its parameters and its possibilities, and maybe the kind of the narrative that the institution is maybe the kind of challenging the idea that the institution is the only site of kind of organized pedagogy, that there are no possibilities, rather saying it's a site of violence on bodies and on imaginations. Gelare, thinking about military practices and the military imaginary, and the way in which conceptions of the Middle East and mock-ups and physical kind of mock-ups of the Middle East, in this case, are crucial to sustaining US military practices, right? So, and then Kesu, you're talking about kind of challenging the idea of land as a commodity to be bought and sold, as private property, and kind of talking about it in relation to land as resource, and how the kind of border actually serves as a kind of limit to property, right? So I was just curious if you could, maybe if any of you want to talk about the way in which borders here function as physical limitation and or ideological kind of limitations, and how these two are interacting for you. Litia, you were talking about the way in which it actually has concrete effects on one's body. So if any of you want to talk about that relationship. Or we could just open it up because we also have like 4 minutes, so.
I mean, I'll say something to Claire. Do I have to turn this on? Is this on? Oh, it's on. Thanks. I would just say, I think that's sort of right, but I think I'm not really trying to challenge an idea of land as private. I mean, this is something that's happening. It's a practice. It shapes the world. It's the world we live in. So I'm trying to say something about what we do to an object at the same time, that it has a lot of other capacities. It's the gap between treating it as a commodity and all the other things that it is that produces the kind of violence that we see in the world.
Mm-hmm. Any questions?
Wait for the mic. Thank you so much. Wait for the mic. I want to thank you all for the incredibly beautiful way that you brought your souls and your intelligence and your bodies and your toil and your pain and your intelligence into your presentations. That last one really got to me. Although I work for Cal State, and it makes me feel how much more humane the Cal State is. People don't make as much money. And anyway, that's a whole longer discussion. An issue around what bodies bear. I do a lot of work with the maternal and social justice. Okay, so I guess it's a question for everyone, and I think that you all touched on it, and there are a lot of beautiful overlaps, but what is your name? The last person who spoke?
Litia.
Litia, thank you. Can we direct that embodiment and the way that how can that embodiment that you demonstrated, how can that cut through the misogynist systems that you're all focusing on? In other words, what are some practical strategies and it sounds like you've done a lot of research on that. I mean, the panel is really about strategies, right? Can we talk about that? How we take all those bodies of knowledge that you have presented to us, and thinking about Martha Rosler's work as well. Is my question clear? Where do we go with this? And if anyone wants to address that, but I was thinking particularly of our last speaker because of your, important personal, political articulations and really how it affects the body.
So thank you so much for your question and comments. I want to just say that part of why I even brought this here was because I hoped all y'all would have like a lot of strategies that we could talk about. So that's the first thing. But and that's not a joke at all. But I know I now, as somebody mentioned, as I think Sho mentioned, that I have a small baby, and it blows my mind that the assumption is that I'm worrying about what schools he will go to and what university he will go to. Because for me, it's so broken. I only talked about the public university because that's what I'm in right now, but we could like be here all day for the private universities, right? But it just seems to me so strange that people with a lot of vision and really beautiful imaginations are still sending their children to these machines that like really, and it's hard because also like, of course, I learned everything that I know from school. So like, I don't have the answer at all, but I know that I wish that there were. And there are, like Michelle Dizon has a thing here that's called At Land's Edge, and there are small, there are efforts being made for sure from, people on the ground to teach one another things and resist the kind of hierarchies of knowledge that really are imposed in all university structures, including like Hampshire and whatever. For for real. So anyway, so yeah, I mean, so no, I don't have great strategies. I think every day about just quitting and like maybe try to write a book, like why I quit my tenure track job. Like don't go into it. Like, you know, because I wish that people who I was finding weren't seeking that. And almost everyone that I know who is a really imaginative, wonderful human sees it as a huge privilege, which it is for all of the reasons that I enumerated. And also I just wonder like at what cost. I loved show that you said that it's like violence against bodies, but also against imaginations. Like, so I don't know. So yeah, so I don't know. But I'm hoping all y'all will have ideas.
Well, I don't know if this is going to help you with strategy, but I'm from the Visual Arts Department at UC San Diego. I'm retired, but in the middle of the 70s, the University Council AFT local got restarted again on my campus. And it was overwhelmingly Senate faculty, overwhelmingly assistant professors, because we were a new campus, and new campuses have more of those than mature campuses. And so there is a UCAFT local on your campus. Over time, of course, the two groups that could take advantage of the new Higher Education Employee Relations Act, which brought unionization, public unionization, city, community, state, university, to unionization, was the librarians who were ready to vote right away because they already had a statewide library organization and they were on board with the union right away. And then the next group, and the one that needed it the most, were the lecturers, and we had no trouble whatsoever signing up the cards. So over time, the Senate faculty began to sort of drift away from participation. And I noticed on my campus that as some of my colleagues got tenure, they had their babies, and they became less and less involved. That was just one of the things that happened. But eventually, it became a union of lecturers and librarians, where in fact, there is a bargaining unit for the Senate. So I don't know, you know, it might be worth just looking into and showing up, tracking down the local there. There is one. It's very active. The lecturers and librarians are active through the UC system. The Senate has been largely absent. So there's the real question as to whether it might be possible to find other assistant professors or some of the former, you know, the thing is these Senate people kept paying their dues because they believed in the union, and they would say, it supports the lecturers. Now, I don't know how many of those are left because I retired 3 years ago, but you know what I'm saying is that there's another way of thinking about it, and that's the union way. And as I often say, you know, the unions are not perfect, but they are a lever. And there are certain possibilities there, and perhaps you might just explore it. And if you'd like to talk to me afterwards, I'll hang around.
Thank you.